The 19-year-old alien noble tried to mock him, but the human simply walked away. A silence that spoke volumes. The Veilthus Concord Station was not a beautiful place. Not in any way that most people would use that word. It was large, functional, and cold in the way that old machines are cold, full of purpose, but empty of warmth. It orbited a dying amber star at the far edge of explored space, a place where the light arrived tired, and the shadows never quite left the corridors. Dozens of species passed through its docking bays every week, carrying their flags, their languages, their complicated histories, and their quiet judgments about everyone else. Caleb Harmon arrived on a Tuesday, though Tuesday meant nothing out here. He was 38 years old, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that looked like they had seen too many late nights and not enough good news. He carried a worn leather bag over one shoulder and a small notebook tucked under his arm. The same notebook he had carried for 6 years, filled with observations, names, sketches of faces, and the occasional sentence that had struck him as worth remembering. He was not a tall man, not a particularly impressive one to look at. He wore a plain gray jacket with the small blue patch of the Earth Federated Council on the left shoulder, and he walked through the docking bay with the unhurried pace of someone who had long ago stopped trying to arrive dramatically. His name was on the official roster as Cultural Liaison and Diplomatic Representative, 2nd grade. It was not a glamorous title. It meant he was responsible for building relationships, filing reports, attending committees, and generally making sure that humanity's small corner of the galactic table did not get quietly folded up and removed while no one was looking. His supervisor had seemed surprised by that. "The outer station," she had said. "Caleb, it's mostly ceremonial. You would be sitting in committee rooms with delegates from a dozen species, arguing about integration frameworks that nobody ever actually uses." "That is fine," he had said. "I am good at rooms." She had let him go, mostly because nobody else wanted it. His assistant was already waiting for him when he cleared customs. Dara Voss was 27 years old, from Albuquerque, with short dark hair and the kind of organized energy that made her capable of tracking 6 things at once, while also noticing that the ceiling panel above Gate 7 was flickering. She had been on the station for 2 weeks already, setting up their shared office, learning the layout, and forming opinions about most of the staff that she had not been asked for, but planned to share anyway. "Your room is on level 4, she said, falling into step beside him without a greeting, the way people do when they have been waiting long enough that the greeting feels unnecessary. "The committee orientation is tomorrow at 9. The seating chart puts us in Tier 3, which is basically the galactic version of the kids' table, but I filed a note about it." "Don't," Caleb said. "I already did." "Withdraw it." She looked at him sideways. "We are seated below the Drovhari delegation. The Drovhari have not filed an original proposal in 30 years. We are not here to argue about chairs." She made a sound that was not quite agreement, but was not quite disagreement either, and led him down the long corridor toward the residential wing. The station hummed around them, the deep, low sound of recycled air and distant engines, the kind of sound that you stopped hearing after the first day and never quite forgot after you left. Caleb paused once, at the wide observation window at the end of Corridor 7, and looked out at the amber star. It was swollen and slow, burning its last fuel in great arcs of copper light. It was beautiful, in a quiet and sad sort of way. He stood there for a moment longer than Dara expected, then followed her to the elevator without saying anything about it. He did not sleep well that first night. He rarely did in new places. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed in his assigned room and wrote 3 lines in his notebook, capped the pen, and lay down in the dark, with his eyes open for a while, before sleep finally arrived. He was thinking about his wife. He often did, in the quiet. Her name had been Laura, and she had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a fast and cruel illness that the doctors had seen too late, and that Caleb had been 2 star systems away when it happened. He had made it back in time for the last 4 days, and that was something, but it was also not enough, and it never would be. He did not talk about her. He did not need to. She was in the notebook, in the way he listened when people spoke, in the particular patience that he carried with him like a coat he never took off. She had always told him that his greatest quality was that he never needed a room to know his worth. He was still figuring out if that was a compliment or a warning. The next morning came gray and efficient. The orientation session was held in the Grand Deliberation Hall, a vast circular room with tiered seating built to hold delegates of very different sizes, shapes, and social customs. The ceiling was domed and faintly luminous, casting soft blue light across the rows. Species that Caleb had studied only in briefing files were now sitting 20 feet away from him. The tall, insect-like Velhari, with their compound eyes and very precise movements. The broad-shouldered Kellian engineers, who communicated partly through color shifts across their skin. The quiet and ancient Dravhari, plant-adjacent beings who moved slowly and thought deeply, and at least 4 other delegations that Caleb had only partial notes on. He took out his notebook and began adding to them. The Zarathi delegation arrived last. Everyone in the room knew they would. It was a custom. The Zarathi had been arriving last to things for 400 years, because to them, arriving last meant arriving when the room was already watching. They were tall, gold-scaled, and dressed in the deep red and silver ceremonial cloth of the Dominion's noble houses. They moved with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once in their civilization's history been told to hurry up. At the front of the delegation walked a young male, young even by Zarathi standards, which was saying something for a species that lived 3 times as long as humans. He was 19 years old, which translated to roughly the same in developmental terms. His name, according to the official roster, was Lord Vane Sorath, envoy of the 3rd noble house of the Zarathi Dominion, son of High Regent Sorath, sent here as part of a new initiative designed to give young Zarathi nobles a taste of real galactic diplomacy. He had gold eyes, bright and sharp. He had the kind of posture that did not come from discipline, but from never once having been in a room where he was not the most important person present. He scanned the hall as he entered, taking a slow and visible inventory of every delegation present, and when his gaze passed over the human section, it stopped for exactly 1 second before moving on, the way a person's eyes pause over something small and familiar and not particularly interesting. Dara noticed. Her jaw tightened. She wrote something in her own notes that she underlined twice. Caleb noticed too. He wrote 1 short line in his notebook, then turned the page. The session began. The station's senior moderator, a Velhari elder named Chaos, opened with a long address about the purpose of the committee, the goals of the integration framework, and the importance of mutual respect among all delegations, regardless of how long their civilization had existed. Vane listened, with his chin slightly raised. He did not take notes. Caleb did not look at him again for the rest of the session. But the room had already begun, in its quiet way, to take shape around the 2 of them. One who had arrived, ready to be seen, and one who had arrived, ready to work. In the slow and complicated world of interstellar diplomacy, those 2 things almost never ended up pointing in the same direction. And the station hummed on around them both, indifferent and patient, the way old things tend to be. The 19-year-old alien noble tried to mock him, but the human simply walked away. A silence that spoke volumes. The first real committee session was scheduled for the following morning, and by the time Caleb and Dara arrived, the Grand Deliberation Hall was already filling up. The hall looked different during a working session than it had during orientation. The soft ceremonial lighting had been replaced with the flat, even glow of practical overhead panels. Delegates moved through the tiered rows with data tablets and translation earpieces, finding their assigned seats and arranging their materials. The large central speaking floor, a circular platform of pale stone, was empty for now, but already felt like something that mattered. Dara had printed out a seating diagram and color-coded it, which Caleb had not asked for, but accepted without comment. He found his chair in the third tier, set his bag down, and placed his notebook on the table in front of him. He uncapped his pen. He was ready. The session's purpose was simple in theory. Each delegation would rise and present their civilization's primary proposed contribution to the committee's cross-species integration framework. It was meant to be introductory, a way for each group to establish their focus before the real work of drafting and negotiating began in the weeks ahead. Most of the presentations were expected to be brief and formal. The Velhari elder, Caius, opened the floor and called the delegations in the order listed on the agenda. The Kellian engineers went first and spoke efficiently about infrastructure proposals, their skin cycling through pale greens and blues as they talked. The Drovhari elder, a soft-spoken being named Dr. Rave Phil, spoke slowly and carefully about cross-species environmental standards. A small delegation from the Ashari territories offered a brief note about communication protocols. Then, Kez called the human delegation. Caleb stood. He did not check his notes. He had not prepared a speech in the formal sense. No dramatic opening. No long list of Earth's accomplishments. He simply stood at the table, looked at the room, and spoke in the plain and unhurried way that he spoke about most things. He said that humanity was new to this table and knew it. He said that humans had arrived here not with the longest history or the most advanced technology, but with something that their short and difficult past had built into them almost without their knowing, the ability to keep going when things got hard. He said that Earth's hope was not to impress the committee, but to contribute something honest to it, and that if there was one thing humans had learned from centuries of struggling against themselves and their own worst instincts, it was how to find common ground in uncomfortable places. It was not a long speech. It did not have grand language or sweeping gestures, but it was real, and the room felt it in the way rooms sometimes feel things that are real. A slight shift, a quiet settling, the way people stop scrolling through their tablets and actually look up. Then Caleb sat down, opened his notebook, and started writing. He did not see Van's face in that moment, but Dara did. Lord Van Sorath had been watching the entire presentation with the particular expression of someone who is simultaneously bored and looking for something to use. When Caleb finished and sat down, Van leaned slowly toward the senior Zarathi advisor seated at his right. He did not lean far, and he did not lower his voice very much, and the translation matrix that every delegate wore as a small device behind one ear was sensitive enough to catch it clearly. He said, "A very sincere performance, like watching a short-lived animal describe its cage as though it were a garden." Two Zarathi delegates near him made small sounds of amusement. A Velhari junior aide glanced away quickly. A Kellian engineer's skin shifted briefly into an uneasy orange. Dara's hand closed around her stylus hard enough that her knuckles went pale. Caleb finished the sentence he was writing. He set the pen down. He looked up. He turned his head and found Vane's gold eyes looking back at him with the calm amusement of someone who had just thrown a small stone into still water and was waiting to watch the rings spread. Caleb held that look for 3 seconds, not aggressively, not with hurt, not with the particular tight expression people wear when they are working hard to seem unbothered. He simply looked, the way a person looks at something that they have already understood and do not need to spend more time on. Then he picked up his pen again and turned back to his notebook. He asked Elder Chaos, in a perfectly ordinary voice, whether the afternoon session would cover the scheduling format for the working group breakdowns, because he wanted to make sure his reporting structure was aligned with the committee calendar. It was such an ordinary question, such a plain and practical thing to say. Vane blinked. The session moved on. Notes were taken. Elder Chaos wrapped up the morning with a reminder about documentation deadlines. Delegates began collecting their things and filing toward the corridor. In the hallway outside the hall, Dara fell into step beside Caleb and kept her voice low, which for Dara meant it was still loud enough for people nearby to hear. "He called you a caged animal," she said, in front of 40 delegates, with the translation matrix running. "I heard," Caleb said. "And you just wrote something down." "I was finishing a thought, Caleb." He stopped walking and looked at her with an expression that was patient and a little tired and completely sincere. "Dara, he wanted me to react. He wanted something to point at. If I had stood up and said something sharp, or filed a complaint, or even looked upset, that would have been the story. That would have been the thing everyone remembered about the human delegation today." "And instead?" "Instead," he said, "the thing everyone remembered about the human delegation today was the speech." She thought about that. She did not look entirely convinced, but she was thinking about it, which meant she was halfway there. They walked toward the cafeteria on level 2. Caleb bought a coffee that tasted like it had been made by a machine that understood coffee only academically, and he drank it without complaining. Back in the hall, in the nearly empty third tier, Lord Vayan Sorath stood for a moment longer than he meant to. He was waiting, not consciously, but waiting all the same. Waiting for the ripple he had expected. Waiting for a report to be filed, or a message to be sent to the senior moderator. Or at the very least, a cold look from across the corridor. There was nothing. The human was already gone. His advisor appeared at his shoulder. "The afternoon session begins at 2. Shall I review the agenda?" "Yes," Vayan said, still looking at the empty seat in the third tier. His advisor began talking. Vayan listened. But something small and unfamiliar had lodged itself in the back of his thinking, like a splinter he could not see. The image of a man who had been insulted in front of a room full of people and had responded by asking about scheduling. He did not know what to do with that yet. He decided, without quite deciding, that he was not finished with Caleb Harmon. Not because he was threatened, he told himself, but because he was curious. Because a creature that did not react the way it was supposed to react was either broken or hiding something, and either way, it was interesting. He straightened his ceremonial jacket, raised his chin to its usual angle, and walked toward the corridor. The afternoon session would begin soon. There would be other opportunities. He was patient. The Zirathi were always patient. What he did not yet understand, what would take him many more days to begin to see, was that patience and stillness are not the same thing, and that the man he was studying had not been still because he was hiding. He had been still because he had nothing to prove. That was a very different thing. But Vayan was 19 years old, and had grown up in a world where power was always loud. He did not know that yet. The station hummed. The amber star burned slowly outside the windows. And somewhere on level 2, Caleb Harmon drank his bad coffee and wrote 4 more lines in his notebook, and did not think about Vayan Sorath at all. The 19-year-old alien noble tried to mock him, but the human simply walked away. A silence that spoke volumes. The second week on the station moved the way bureaucratic things always move. Slowly at first, then all at once, then slowly again. Committee sessions ran every morning and most afternoons. The working groups had been divided into 3 focus areas: communication standards, resource sharing protocols, and what Elder Case called civic integration, which basically meant figuring out how different species could occupy shared spaces without accidentally offending, harming, or completely confusing one another. Caleb had been assigned to all three, which was not standard practice for a second-grade liaison, but he had asked for it, and nobody had objected, because nobody else had asked for it either. He showed up to every session. He took notes. He read the supporting documents that most other delegates skimmed. He stayed after the room emptied on 2 occasions to ask Elder Kess quiet questions about procedural history. And Kess, who had been moderating committees like this for 30 years and had grown very tired of delegates who did not do their reading, found herself answering those questions with more care than she had planned to. Dara managed the logistics and kept the reporting organized and reminded Caleb twice a day to eat something. Life on the station settled into a rhythm. But Vane had not forgotten. It started small, the way these things usually do when they are done by someone who is intelligent enough to be subtle. During the second week's communication standards session, Vane raised a point about the limitations of human translation matrices. Specifically, that they had been calibrated to Earth's most widely spoken languages, leaving a gap in nuance for certain philosophical and emotional concepts that older civilizations expressed with much greater precision. It was technically accurate. It was also framed in a way that made it sound like humanity had submitted an incomplete application to a language program. Several delegates looked at the human section. Caleb wrote the point down in his notebook, added 2 sentences of his own, and when the floor opened for responses, raised his hand and agreed with Vane's technical observation. He said it calmly, acknowledged the gap, and then noted that the Earth Federated Council had already submitted a request to the Valhari Translation Archive for an expanded calibration package, and that in the meantime he would welcome any delegate willing to flag communication gaps directly to his office so they could be logged and addressed. He looked briefly toward Vane when he said it. He was not being sarcastic. That was the thing that made it confusing. Vane blinked. The floor moved on. 2 days later, Caleb arrived at the civic integration session to find that the seating arrangement had been quietly adjusted. The human section had been shifted from Tier 3 to a position near the outer edge of Tier 4. Technically still within the acceptable range for junior delegations, but clearly further back than it had been, and clearly not done by accident. Dara arrived 3 minutes after Caleb, and immediately pulled up the official seating protocol on her tablet. "This is wrong," she said, her voice careful and very controlled. "I can file a formal challenge before the session starts. We have grounds." Caleb looked at the adjusted seats for a moment, then he put his bag down in the new position and sat. "Caleb, it's fine," he said. He opened his notebook. "Sit down." She sat, though it cost her something. Across the hall in the Zarathi section, a comfortable position in Tier 1, Vane watched this with the focused attention of someone running an experiment. He had expected complaint. He had expected an attempt to assert status, even a small and futile one, because that was what beings with pride did when their pride was poked. Instead, the human sat down in the wrong seat and opened his notebook. Vane turned to his notes. He told himself it was unimportant. He turned back once more, just briefly, to check. Caleb was writing something. He did not look up. After the session, Caleb stayed behind to speak with Dr. Rave Phil. The Drovhari elder had mentioned during the discussion that her research team had been working on a proposal for shared atmospheric standards in multi-species residential areas, but that the proposal had stalled 3 times over the past 2 years due to lack of interest from other delegations. Caleb asked her to send him the proposal. She looked at him for a moment, a long, slow look, in the way that Drovhari looked at things when they were deciding whether to believe them. "You will read it?" she said. "I will read it tonight," he said. He did. He spent 3 hours on it. He sent her a response the next morning with 12 pages of notes, 2 suggested revisions, and a question about the methodology in Section 4 that she had not been asked in 2 years of presenting the proposal to other delegates. She read his response sitting very still, the way Drovhari sat when something surprised them. She sent it to 2 colleagues. They were also surprised. Meanwhile, Vayan escalated. At a joint working group session midway through the 3rd week, he raised the topic of civilization longevity and its relevance to long-term planning in the integration framework. He handled it skillfully, the way someone handles a knife that is also a point being made. You could not object to the knife itself, only to what he was cutting. He spoke about the value of generational continuity in policymaking, the idea that civilizations with longer lifespans and longer institutional memory were naturally better equipped to plan for the future of the galactic community. He spoke about how short-lived species, however energetic and well-intentioned, brought an inherent instability to long-term frameworks, simply because their representatives changed so frequently. Their priorities shifted so quickly. Their history was so brief. He did not say humans. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew the math. Humans lived 80 to 90 years on average. The Zirathi lived close to 300. The Drovhari had delegates in this very hall who had been attending committees since before humanity had left its own solar system. Several delegates glanced at the human section. Caleb was writing. He had been writing since before Vane started speaking, and he kept writing while Vane spoke. And he was still writing when Vane finished and sat down with the small, satisfied tilt of a person who has placed something precisely where they wanted it. The floor opened. Caleb raised his hand. He said, "That is a thoughtful point about planning horizons. I would add only that instability and change are different things, and that short institutional cycles have historically produced faster adaptation in response to unexpected conditions, which may be as relevant to a long-term framework as longevity, depending on what the framework needs to survive. Then, I would also note that several of the most enduring human institutions on Earth are older than the Earth Federated Council's membership in this body. Continuity takes different shapes." He set his pen down. "But these are good questions for the working group. I think Dr. Phil's proposal actually addresses some of this directly. I can share my annotations if that would be useful to the room." 3 delegates said yes. Phil looked at her own hands for a moment in the way that Drovhari did when they were quietly moved by something. Vane said nothing. That evening, the station held a formal diplomatic dinner in the upper hall, the kind of event that was technically optional but practically required, where every delegation dressed appropriately and sat at long tables and ate whatever the station's kitchen had managed to adapt for their biology, and where conversation was supposed to be pleasant and the political maneuvering was supposed to be invisible. Caleb wore the same gray jacket with the earth patch. Dara wore a dark blue dress and the expression of someone who had been told twice to relax and was not going to. The dinner was going well enough. Polite conversation, careful diplomacy, the usual management of a room full of species who all had different definitions of a compliment. Until the dessert course, when Vane stood, raised his glass, and smiled the practiced smile of someone who has prepared something and is pleased with it. He said, "I would like to offer a toast to our human colleagues who remind us with great sincerity that even the briefest candles believe themselves to be stars." He said it the way a person says something cruel when they want it to land like a joke, so that any objection looks like an overreaction. The table went quiet. 40 delegates from 12 species turned, some slowly, some quickly, to look at the human section. Dara's fork stopped halfway to her plate. Caleb set his own fork down. He looked at Vane. He looked at him for 2 full seconds, in that flat and unhurried way. Not with fury, not with hurt, not with the tight-jawed dignity of a man swallowing something difficult. He simply looked. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the room. No slammed door, no parting words, no dramatic pause in the doorway. He simply left. The silence he left behind was one of the largest silences that room had ever held. Vane stood with his glass raised. He lowered it slowly. He had expected everything except that. The 19-year-old alien noble tried to mock him, but the human simply walked away. A silence that spoke volumes. Nobody talked about the dinner out loud. That was the first thing Vane noticed. In his experience, which was, to be fair, the experience of someone who had spent 19 years inside a system where every slight was answered and every insult produced a countermove. An incident like the dinner should have generated a clear and traceable chain of events. A formal complaint filed with the station's senior moderator. A strongly worded message from the Earth Federated Council. A quiet meeting between the Sarathi advisors and whatever Velhari official was responsible for maintaining diplomatic order on the station. At the very minimum, a cold and obvious silence from the human delegation that would signal displeasure in a way everyone could read. None of that happened. Caleb Harmon arrived at the next morning's session, on time. He sat in his adjusted seat in the outer Tier 4. He opened his notebook. He asked Elder Chaos a clarifying question about the documentation deadline for the Resource Sharing Subcommittee. And then he settled in and took notes for 2 hours while the working group discussed atmospheric circulation standards in multi-species residential wings. It was not patience either, not the brittle kind that was just anger with a lid on it. It was something else, something he did not have a clean word for, and that gap in his vocabulary bothered him in a way he could not explain to his advisor without sounding like he was losing ground. He did not file a note about it. He observed. What he observed, over the course of those days, was a quiet and consistent picture of a man doing his work. Caleb attended every session, not just the ones his designation required, but the optional working group meetings that most senior delegates sent junior staff to, and which junior staff usually attended while checking messages on their tablets. He participated when he had something to add, and stayed quiet when he did not, which meant that when he did speak, the room had learned to listen. He built small connections with delegates that the larger civilizations largely ignored. The Ashari observer, who had not been asked her name by a Tier 1 delegate in 3 weeks. The young Kellyan engineer, who had submitted a proposal that kept getting tabled. The Drovhari archivist, named Essa, who was attending her first major committee session, and had the slightly overwhelmed look of someone who had spent most of her career in a research library. Caleb had asked Essa her name on the 2nd day. He had remembered it on the 5th. Dara watched all of this and kept her own notes. She had been doing this quietly since the 1st week, and by the end of the 3rd week, her notes had filled a separate file that she had labeled, with the dry, private humor of someone who worked long hours alone. Things happening in rooms where nobody is shouting. What she wrote was this, that Caleb had become, without announcing it or organizing it or apparently intending it, the person in the room that people were talking to. Not the loudest voice, not the most credentialed, not the representative of the most powerful civilization. Just the person who had done the reading, remembered the names, showed up early, and treated every delegate in every tier as though their work mattered equally. This was not nothing. In a room full of species who spent enormous energy managing hierarchy and status, a person who simply did not participate in those games was either ignorable or magnetic. And somewhere around the end of the 3rd week, the balance had tipped from one to the other. The shift became visible publicly during an open-floor discussion on the 4th week, 2 days after the dinner. Dr. Rhea Phil rose during the civic integration session and spoke about something that was not technically on the agenda. She did it calmly and with the particular authority that drove Hari elders carried, the authority of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. She said she had been observing the committee's dynamics and had noticed a pattern. She did not name anyone. She described the pattern simply, that the delegates who produced the most substantive work in committee sessions were not always the delegates who occupied the most prominent seats or spoke the most often. She said that in her 40 years of attending interspecies committees, the proposals that actually survived and became policy were almost never the ones that had been introduced with the most ceremony. They were the ones built carefully, quietly, from real knowledge and real listening. She said that she had encountered in her time on the station a human cultural concept that she found worth discussing. The concept was dignity under pressure, the ability to continue doing good work, not because one was being watched or rewarded, but because the work itself was the point. She said she found it one of the more interesting things she had encountered in 4 decades of study. Then she sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the young Kellyan engineer raised a hand and said, without looking at anyone in particular, that he agreed with Dr. Phil's observation and thought the committee should consider revising how its working group contributions were weighted in the final documentation. 3 more delegates followed, then 2 more after that. None of them mentioned the dinner. None of them mentioned Caleb directly. None of them needed to. The conversation that followed was the most substantive open-floor discussion the committee had held since the session began. Vane sat very still through all of it. That afternoon, his advisor quietly informed him that Elder Caius had requested a private meeting. The request had been phrased courteously. It was not optional. Vane went. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. Caius did not raise her voice. She was Velhari, and the Velhari did not raise their voices because they did not need to. They had compound eyes that could watch 6 things at once, and they had been in the business of keeping interspecies rooms functional for longer than most civilizations had existed. She spoke to Vane in the measured and precise way that Velhari spoke when they were being serious, which was most of the time. She said that his conduct at the dinner had been noted. She said that the Concord's diplomatic protocol provided a clear framework for addressing such incidents, and that she expected the framework to be followed. She said that the Zerathi Dominion's relationship with the Concord was valued and important, and that she would find it very unfortunate if a young envoy's early and promising career were marked by a formal citation at his first major committee assignment. She did not say apologize. She did not say Caleb Harmon. She did not need to say either. Vane returned to his quarters and sat at his desk for a long time. His advisor knocked at 7 and asked if he needed anything. Vane said no. The advisor left. Alone, in the quiet of a room that was comfortable and well-furnished and completely empty, Vane found himself replaying the dinner. Not the toast itself. He had replayed that already and found it perfectly constructed, which was not the problem. The problem was what came after. The sound of a chair being pushed back, footsteps, a door, opening and closing. No slammed door, nothing that could be pointed at and used. Just a man standing up and leaving. He turned it over in his mind, the way you turn over a stone when you are not sure what you were expecting to find underneath. The Zerathi understanding of power was built on visibility, on presence, on the very clear and very public demonstration of where you stood and what you were worth. Vane had grown up in houses with walls covered in lineage portraits, in rooms where every seat was a statement, in conversations where every word was weighed against 300 years of family reputation. In that world, walking away was surrender. Walking away was the admission that you had nothing to say, nothing to fight with, nothing worth the room's attention. But the human had not looked like surrender. He had not looked like anything dramatic at all. He had looked like a man who had somewhere more important to be. That was the part Vane could not figure out. Because the man had nowhere more important to be. He was a second-grade liaison from a junior civilization sitting in Tier 4. There was nowhere less important to be in the entire structure of galactic diplomacy. And yet he had walked away from a pointed toast at a formal dinner and looked, somehow, like the only person in the room who did not need the room. Vane sat for a very long time. Outside his window, the amber star burned its slow and ancient light across the dark, and the station hummed its constant low note. And somewhere on level 2, Caleb Harmon was reading Dr. Thill's revised proposal and writing notes in the margins. And the thought had not crossed his mind once. The 19-year-old alien noble tried to mock him, but the human simply walked away. A silence that spoke volumes. 3 weeks later, the committee produced something nobody had expected. It was called the Veilthus Integration Proposal, and it was, by the quiet consensus of every senior moderator who read it, the most complete and actionable cross-species framework the Concord had produced in 11 years. It ran to 240 pages, with detailed working proposals for communication standards, residential integration, shared resource protocols, and a new method for weighing long-term and short-term planning needs that actually address the tension between short-lived and long-lived species without pretending the tension did not exist. The primary architect listed on the cover was Caleb Harmon, cultural liaison and diplomatic representative, second grade, Earth Federated Council. His work was cited 23 times in the appendix. Rave Phil's atmospheric proposal, the one that had been stalled for 2 years before Caleb had sent her 12 pages of notes on a Tuesday night, was incorporated in full as Section 9. The young Kellyan engineers' resource-sharing framework, which had been tabled 3 times before Caleb had read it carefully and spent an afternoon helping him restructure the presentation, was the foundation of Section 12. The Ashari observer, whose name nobody in Tier 1 had bothered to learn, had contributed a communication protocol in Section 6 that Elder Caius later described as one of the most practical things she had read in recent memory. Dara's separate file of notes had grown to 61 pages. She did not share it with anyone. She printed it out, put it in a folder, and labeled the folder simply with the date and the station name. She thought someday it might be worth something to someone who wanted to understand how things actually happened, as opposed to how they looked like they happened. The closing ceremony was held in the Grand Deliberation Hall, dressed for the occasion. The flat working lights replaced with the warmer ceremonial glow, the tiered seats full, the air carrying the low and structured formality of a room that knows it is marking something. Elder Caius gave the closing address. She was not a sentimental speaker. The Velhari rarely were. But she had been doing this for 30 years. And she had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do at the end of a process was name what had actually happened, plainly and without decoration. She said that the work produced by this committee was a result of something that was both simple and rare. She said that diplomacy was frequently mistaken for performance, and that performance was frequently mistaken for strength, and that this committee had reminded her, at least in parts, what it looked like when those two things were separated out. She did not look at any specific delegation when she said it. She did not need to. The room applauded in the various ways that the species present expressed approval. The Velhari's precise triple tap, the Drovari's slow and synchronized sway, the Kellyan skin shifts into warm gold, the human's simple clapping, which was apparently one of the few things in the universe that translated naturally across almost every species that had hands. Vane stood near the back of the hall. He had not been required to attend the ceremony. His official role in the committee had been advisory, and the Zirathi protocol for closing ceremonies gave senior envoys the option to send a representative rather than attend personally. His advisor had prepared a proxy statement. The statement was polite and appropriate and said nothing in particular. Vayan had not sent it. He had come himself. He stood in the back of the hall and watched the ceremony, and did not fully understand, even then, why he had come. Some part of him had needed to see it, the finished thing, the result of 5 weeks of work, that he had spent a significant portion of undermining, and that had somehow survived, and grown, and become something real, despite all of it. He watched Caleb receive acknowledgement from Elder Case, with the same quiet nod the man used for everything. No performance, no swelling pride, just the clean and simple acknowledgement of a person who knows what they did, and does not need the room to confirm it for them. After the ceremony, the hall slowly emptied. Delegates moved in groups toward the reception corridor. The lights began their gradual return to the functional flat glow of ordinary station life. Chairs were pushed back, tablets tucked away, conversations drifted toward dinner plans and departure schedules. Vayan moved toward the corridor. He did not make a decision exactly. It was more that he found himself walking in a particular direction, and the direction happened to be toward Caleb Harmon, who was standing near the hall's east exit, with his bag over one shoulder and his notebook under his arm, saying something to a young Velhari archivist, who was laughing, an odd clicking sound that Velhari made when genuinely amused at whatever he had just said. The archivist saw Vayan approaching and went quiet, in the instinctive way that junior members of smaller species went quiet when Zirathi nobles entered their immediate orbit. She excused herself and left. Caleb watched her go, then turned and looked at Vayan. They stood in the corridor for a moment. Around them, the last of the delegates were filtering out, conversations fading down the passage. The station's hum filled the space between them. Vayan said, "I owe you a formal apology under the Concord's diplomatic protocol. I will submit the documentation by end of day." Caleb nodded once. "All right. That should have been the end of it. That was the protocol. The apology was stated. The documentation would follow. The record would be clean." Vayan had said the required words, and could now turn and walk back into the comfortable architecture of his position, and his title, and his civilization's long and confident history. He did not turn and walk away. He stood for another moment, and then he said quietly, in a way that was clearly not prepared, not polished, not the voice of a noble house envoy, but of a 19-year-old who had spent 3 weeks being confused by something he could not name. "At the dinner, when you walked out, why did you not say something? You could have said something. You had the room. You could have." Caleb looked at him, not unkindly, not with the satisfaction of a person who has been waiting for the other person to finally ask the question. Just directly, the way he looked at most things. "Because I did not need you to be wrong out loud," he said. "I already knew it. That was enough." Vayan looked at him. "The room would have remembered whatever I said," Caleb continued, his voice plain and unhurried. "An argument, a comeback, a clever line, that would have been the story. Instead, the story is the document, 240 pages. That is what I wanted the room to remember." He adjusted the strap of his bag. A response that needs an audience is not really a response. It is a performance. I was not performing. It was a different kind of quiet than his usual silence, which was the quiet of someone composing their next move. This was the quiet of someone who had just had a door opened that they had not known was there, and were standing in front of it, trying to decide whether to step through. He said, "Where I come from, walking away is losing." "Where I come from," Caleb said, "it depends on what you are walking toward." He nodded once more, that same clean final nod, and moved toward the exit. Dara was waiting at the far end of the corridor, with 2 cups of coffee, and an expression that had been composing itself for 3 weeks into the perfect combination of vindicated and fond. She handed Caleb a cup without saying anything for exactly 4 seconds, which for Dara was a long time. Then she said, "For the record, I have been waiting to watch that kid figure out he lost for 23 days. He didn't lose," Caleb said, taking the cup. "He's just starting to learn something. That is also a win," she said. He thought about that. Fair enough. They walked toward the docking bay. Their departure window was in 2 hours. Caleb's report was already drafted and filed. Dr. Phil had sent a message that morning, formal by Drovhari standards, which meant it was 2 careful paragraphs long, and used the word gratitude only once, saying that she hoped they would meet again at a future committee. The young Kellyan engineer had sent a much shorter message that simply said, "Thank you for reading it." The Velhari archivist, whose name was Essa, had sent nothing, but Dara had seen her in the corridor before the ceremony, and the young archivist had looked at Caleb with the expression of someone who had decided something important about a person, and was comfortable with the decision. Behind them, in the slowly emptying hall, Lord Vane Sorath stood alone for a long time. His advisor would find him there 15 minutes later and ask carefully whether everything was all right. Vane would say yes, and it would be true, though not in the way his advisor expected. Something had shifted inside him. Not broken, not collapsed, but moved. Like furniture rearranged in a room where you had always known exactly where everything was. The room was the same. The things in it were the same. But they were in different places, and that meant you had to learn the room again, which was uncomfortable, but also, and this was the part he had not expected, interesting. He had come to this station to observe a junior species and confirm what he already believed about them. Instead, he had watched a tired man with a worn notebook quietly rearrange the room around him without once raising his voice or asking anyone to notice. Vane did not know yet what to do with that. He was 19 years old and had been taught his whole life that power was something you demonstrated. He was only beginning to suspect, in the slow and uncomfortable way that real learning always arrives, that the most durable kind of power was the kind that did not need to be demonstrated at all. He was going to spend a long time thinking about that. Outside the station's wide observation windows, the amber star burned on, old and slow and indifferent, spending itself across the dark the way things that are truly powerful spend themselves, without fanfare, without audience, without any need at all for the universe to look up and take notice. The human was already gone. The corridor was quiet, and somewhere in the back of a very young and very old mind, the question had taken root. What did it mean to be strong enough that you did not need anyone to know it? He did not have the answer yet, but for the first time in his life, he was genuinely asking.